Vamos a comenzar con esta tercera conferencia magistral del Congreso de ALTEC, que tenemos el gusto de contar para esta tercera conferencia magistral con Bronwyn Hall. Es una profesora muy reconocida de economía emérita de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Ha sido profesor visitante en el MPI de Múnich y investigador asociado en el NBER y en el IFS de London. Ella ha publicado numerosos artículos, es muy reconocida en temas de economía y econometría, del cambio técnico y la innovación, y es editora del Handbook de Economía de la Innovación de la serie de Elsevier. Sus temas de investigación incluyen análisis comparativos de los sistemas de patentes de la Comunidad Europea y de Estados Unidos, el uso de información para citar, basado en las citas de las patentes, para la evaluación de activos intangibles como es el conocimiento, estudios comparativos sobre niveles de inversión en investigación y desarrollo a nivel de las firmas y otros estudios de innovación, mediciones de los retornos de la investigación y desarrollo y la innovación, y análisis de la política tecnológica, tales como los subsidios asociados a la investigación y desarrollo y los sistemas de incentivos como el que tuvimos en México y que volvemos a recuperar en el caso de México este año. Ella ha hecho contribuciones muy importantes a la investigación en economía aplicada a través de la creación de software para estimaciones econométricas y bases de datos a nivel de firma para el estudio de la innovación, incluyendo el uso de la base de datos del NBER, no sé cómo se traduce, para las patentes de Estados Unidos. Es realmente un honor para nuestro grupo, para este grupo de Iberoamérica asociado con ALTEC, contar con una conferencia de la profesora Hall. Entonces, sin más, I'm going to give her the floor.
Okay. Good. Buenos dias. Like my fellow keynoters, that's all the Spanish you get. Except for possibly gracias. In spite of the fact that I'm from California, so I really have no excuse. This is my third trip to Mexico City, but I was absolutely delighted to come again, partly because the last one was only 3 or 4 years ago, and things keep changing. I see all kinds of new things around and so forth. It's really impressive. So in any case, I'm very happy to be here. The talk is not a specific paper. It's more, sort of some thoughts on tax policy and innovation. Partly, I mean, it may be of interest particularly to people from Mexico because recently the law in Mexico has changed. And so I'm hoping that at least one person in this room knows more about it than I do. I'm going to say a few words about it later. So these are some questions which I got asked by people at the European Commission and the IMF. For a talk last year, and it seems like they're interesting questions. Why are there special tax incentives? Many people know why, but I'll say a few words about it. Our patent box is a good idea because this is an idea which has been spreading in Europe, and I will. A patent box, for those of you who don't know what it is, you might as well tell you now. It's simply a special corporate income tax rate on income derived from either patents or, in some cases, other forms of intellectual property protection. And it's something which the Europeans have pioneered. How to design R&D tax credits, this is very relevant for Mexico, I think. And then these larger questions that I don't have a whole lot to say on, but I'll try to, partly because we don't have definitive answers among people who look into this, but I still will say something about them, which is how do we know how much we should support R&D as a policy, and what about this issue of coordinating across countries? In other words, what I do on my, because of the existence of spillovers, what I do on my, with my tax policy on R&D is going to have quite a bit of impact on other countries and vice versa. So to review the rationales for innovation support or R&D support, the idea is that there are benefits from innovative activity by one firm that accrue to other firms and individuals which are not priced. In other words, you don't get enough innovation if you just, if you have no patent system, no intellectual property system, and you just leave firms to their own devices. There is a problem because anyone with a good idea can be imitated, not at zero cost, but at some cost that is probably less than the cost of developing the original idea. In other words, imitation is somewhat cheaper than innovation. We have a lot of evidence on this. We know it's not zero, but we do know that it's typically less than the original innovation. There's quite a bit of uncertainty and risk associated with introducing new products and processes. The failure rate can be quite high. It's difficult. Obviously, there's two solutions to risk. One is diversifying across a lot of different activities, which economies do fairly well, but individual firms find difficult to do. And the second one, of course, is insurance, and this is an area where you really, insurance is just not available. Now, these ideas go back to, the final one is related to the risk and uncertainty. I should have mentioned this because it turns out to be fairly important, which is that it is typically the case for a large number of reasons that it is expensive to borrow from banks if it's feasible at all, and the cost of issuing equity is fairly high, which tends to lead to some underinvestment in the activity. Now, all of these ideas go back at least to a well-known paper in 1962 by Kenneth Arrow, and also a related paper by Dick Nelson in 1959. This is in my head right at the moment because last week I was at the memorial conference for Kenneth Arrow, who died at the age of 95 in January. And I can't resist mentioning him because he had a big influence on my thinking in this area. He was at Stanford University where I did my PhD. This is not going forward. There it goes, there. Okay, so one of the first things to discuss here is the definition of innovative activity, or another way to say it, innovation investment, because that's really what we're talking about, is the investments undertaken by private firms and private individuals in the innovation area. And you probably are well aware of the fact that R&D is only part of this. And it turns out, if you look at, there's a few surveys that try to investigate these components that I've listed here. And in the United Kingdom, in particular, I know, but also in some of the European countries. And what you learn from those surveys is that the largest component among these, which is, one reason it may be the largest is because it's also one of the best measured. Some of the costs of organizational innovation, marketing new goods and services, employee training is much less well measured. But the largest one is the purchase, installation, and use of new technologically advanced equipment, okay, and software. That's actually the largest expense. R&D is somewhat less than that, but it's still a pretty good sized. R&D tends to be about 20 to 30% of manufacturing expenditure on innovation. I think around 30% actually. Now, it's pretty obvious that the thing that we're concerned about, which is the benefits that are accruing to firms other than the firms undertaking the investment, namely the spillover, okay, the potential spillover, is going to vary Some of these things, the returns will be captured by the firm fairly easily. Other things are not, particularly the output of R&D and new products, are not going to be able to be totally captured by the firm. And it's also the case that appropriability, which is what we mean, which is the word we use to describe the ability of the firm to capture returns from its investment. Okay, that's the definition of appropriability. Patentability is obviously going to vary across these activities. Now, in some cases, as in the marketing case, it's not just patentability, it's also the use of trademarks. In some sectors, like the creative sector, it's the use of copyrights that's going to enable you to capture returns from investments in new ideas. But I'm generally, in general, I'm focused on patentability here, partly because I come from the technological side of the innovation area, and also because that is probably the largest concern. Now, the standard economic response, economic policy response to a problem of externalities or unpriced spillovers, in this case positive externalities, are listed here. The first one is granting property rights to the person who undertakes the innovation so that he can exclude other people from imitating his idea. That works. It's at the cost. It has a cost, which is the simple cost is of course you've granted him a temporary monopoly on his invention. Therefore, you're going to get some restricted output if he behaves as a profit-maximizing individual. The ability to have varying property right regimes across different countries is actually somewhat constrained by TRIPS, although not totally constrained. You can still, in a developing country setting, you can still do things that are different from those that can be done in a developed country setting. Its property rights are widely used, but they're only as good as their enforcement, which is to say, you're going to need a good legal system if you're going to go down that route. Subsidies to innovative activity of various kinds are widely used across countries. Frequently, they're targeted to particular projects, and that has some advantages because what you can do if you're targeting is you can target projects which have a wider benefit. In particular, things like the creation of standards for some particular activity. The fact that I can sit here and talk to you at all is dependent, with slides like this, is dependent on the fact that we have infinitely many standards about how we do IT around the world. And funding the development of those standards is actually a useful subsidy activity. They have high administrative costs in the sense that you need trained individuals, often people with advanced degrees, to administer subsidies because they have to understand to some extent the technology that they're subsidizing. Tax credits have a slightly different flavor, although they're sometimes slightly targeted. For example, towards joint research between a firm and universities. That's very common to have a tax credit targeted to that, to benefit the firm, not the university. But in general, the firm is getting a credit on how much it spends on R&D, so the firm is choosing the projects, which means that the rationale for the project is going to be a private return rationale, which means you won't necessarily get the best spillovers out of it, because that's not how it's being chosen. It doesn't have as high an administrative cost as the subsidy route, but it does have an audit cost in the sense that many tax systems feel that they have to check that what the firm is claiming as research and development, or some kind of investment, is actually research and development. And tax authorities do complain about this, partly because it requires, again, a little bit of technology expertise to actually be able to distinguish good R&D investments from things that are not really R&D. And firms complain too, because sometimes they can't tell, and I go on at this at great length, but I won't. And then the final alternative, which is pervasive, is direct government spending, especially for R&D towards public goods. We all have, public health departments. There's an enormous amount of spending on defense, which is where, of course, a lot of innovations come from, particularly in the IT area. This has been true, and that's, direct. Now, I'm focused in this talk on the tax policy remedies. Okay, so we're narrowing the topic now. Too bad, but that's how it is. We have to, make choices. So what's available? Okay, what do countries do? Okay, R&D tax credits are very widely used now. Sometimes they get targeted, as I said before, by use of public research organizations, for example. Investment tax credits are also used and can be quite helpful because, of course, for many firms, introducing and innovating, okay, particularly organizational innovation, is really about acquiring new capital equipment and new software in order to change the way you do things, okay? And so your innovation isn't being done by your own R&D, it's being done by acquiring stuff, technologically advanced stuff from other people. As I indicated before, that can be a very large share of innovation investment spending. So having just ordinary investment tax credits does actually encourage that. IP boxes, I've defined it before. Reduced corporate tax, quite reduced, I mean sometimes 0, sometimes 5% or something, corporate tax rates on income from various kinds of IP. And that's a relatively, I think the French may have had one starting in 1971, but by and large, the first of them came in really only in the 2000s. And the relative treatment of debt versus equity finance, this is a little bit subtle, but this has to do with the fact that in a lot of economies, debt is favored as a form of financing purely because interest is deductible against income and dividends are not deductible against income. Dividends from stock are not deductible against income, which means that debt finance is in principle cheaper. That's a simplistic view, but anyway, that's the basic idea. And debt is not ideal for intangible investment of the kind we're talking about, except for these things that you're subsidizing with investment tax credits, things like training of new employees, the creation of human capital, R&D for new products or processes. None of these things are tangible, and debt is not a favorite form of financing for them because of the non-securable nature, because there's no resale market to speak of. There's a little bit of a resale market. It doesn't really work very well, in fact. The only real resale market is selling the firm, the only one that really works. And that actually does happen. Small technology startups being bought by larger firms because the technology has proved itself. But the salvage value from the of technology firms that fail is basically down to a few patent applications, which may or may not be that valuable. So I go a little bit more into the financing channel just to clarify what I'm talking about. The asset that you're creating, if you do, this is now focusing on R&D itself, but that is, as I said, except for the equipment spending, it's the largest component. The equipment spending we understand because that's part of tangible assets, and there's a long history of studies of investment, which are really, it's not the area that we have as many problems, partly because in that area we know how to measure things, okay? And we even know how to measure the used market, the salvage value market. But in the intangible area, namely taking R&D as the main example, the asset you're creating in a firm is largely human capital, which is to say it mostly gets embedded in the employees. They're the ones who learn from doing the R&D and know how to apply it. Now, some of that is going to get lost if your employee turnover is high. In other words, if you don't do R&D by, and those of you who do research will understand this, you don't do R&D by hiring 100 scientists and engineers and then laying them off the next year. Okay, that's just not a very good, it's much better to hire 20 and have them working over a longer period. The firm will obviously retain some knowledge associated with, particularly they'll retain the property rights to some of the knowledge associated with R&D, produced by R&D, but they won't retain rights to the tacit part of it that's embedded in people's heads. And that's, you know, an important part. This means that you have this asset that is not really very securable. The bank can't reclaim it, okay, if you go bankrupt. It's not available to them. An absence of slavery. Williamson, 1988, uses the word not redeployable, okay? There's a lack of a resale market. Now, you know, as you all know, there is now a market for technology. There are some patent markets. Most of them don't work very well, okay? Very difficult to figure out how to value the patents. I mean, I get inquiries all the time from people who wonder if any of the research I've ever done could be used to value patents, because I've got patent value regressions. But, you know, the amount of explanatory power in those regressions is very, very, very small. And it's not really that much of a guide for valuing an individual patent. It might be good for telling you something about patents as a whole related to certain characteristics. There's evidence on the leverage thing, and in the US, leverage, meaning the amount of debt you have relative to equity, is strongly negatively correlated with R&D intensity in the US, and it's no big, you know, no surprise there, I mean, which supports these arguments. I won't go further down that line except to tell you about an interesting cross-industry, cross-country paper, so rather more comprehensive, where basically what they find in this paper is that if you're an equity-dependent industry, okay, and the tax rate on payouts is high, the idea is that the tax rate on corporate payouts, namely dividends and capital gains, which is how people profit from investments in these companies, they basically raise the cost of equity financing, which is what I said before, which is, you know, relative to debt. And in this situation, these industries do reduce their R&D. In other words, they don't seem to have other alternative sources of funding. So, which is, you know, cross-country, cross-industry evidence on this question. So I'm going to shift gears now and go down specifically to the design issues. I'm never quite sure in what order to talk about things, but the previous part of the talk was really the background for why we're engaged in this activity at all. Okay, the idea is there is underinvestment in either R&D or innovation. I don't mean to conflate the two. It's simply that the R&D is typically what has been targeted in the past, and it's the area which we know the most about. As we speak, people are busily engaged in trying to measure the other intangibles. As I speak, I guess you're not speaking, too bad. In measuring the other intangibles that I mentioned, okay, which is these investments in training and investments in marketing activities, investments in organizations. This is a challenging new area of research. Many countries are trying to incorporate measures of these intangibles in the national income accounts. But I'm going to, since I'm talking about tax policy towards them, I'm going to focus on the area that has been most active in the policy regime. So the first thing is about R&D in tax incentive design is that incremental schemes, which is the very first schemes in this area were incremental. What do we mean by incremental? We mean that the rules were set up so that there was some way to predict what the firm had done on R&D in its past, and the idea was to give them credit only for increasing the amount they were doing. Well, that turns out to be devilishly difficult. And the reason it is because every firm is different. That's the whole point of firms. They're trying to be different. Diversification, I mean, not diversification is the wrong word. Differentiation of their activities is how they earn rents. They want to be different from other firms in some dimension, right? Well, what this means is that the only way to really accurately predict how much R&D this firm was doing in the past is to look at the firm itself and see what it was doing, because comparable firms are not really comparable. Well, once you do that, the firm now has control over how much R&D it spends. So the first year, when you surprise them with a tax credit, things are fine. But next year, they already knew a year before what the tax credit was going to look like, and so they can change their behavior to respond to that tax credit in the future, which means that the incremental part is now difficult to measure. And I'm going to give you the mathematics behind it, but it's essentially the problem is to find a measure that tells you how much the firm should spend, was spending on R&D, so you can figure out what the increment is. Why do legislators like this? They like it because it's cheaper. Okay? Remember that R&D is something that people don't like to adjust very strongly. Okay? So it's rather smooth over time. If you look if you look within an established firm, what you will see is that there's very little change in the R&D intensity over time in that firm. And because of this, it's expensive if you subsidize all that R&D, okay? But if you can subsidize only the increment, it's much cheaper to you, and you can have a higher rate, but it's still cheaper. On the design issue, further on the design issue, if you're going to target them, you want to target towards bigger spillovers, as I said before, or towards firms that face more severe credit constraints. And this means that sometimes collaboration with universities and PROs. And the second thing, which is supported by the empirical evidence, is small and new firms seem to face higher costs of capital in most countries. Okay, so you might have different rates for them. There's an issue about loss carry-forwards. If you're concerned about innovation, and you're concerned about startups, and you're concerned about new firms, because you think that's where you might be getting some growth, entrepreneurial growth, and then one of the things that might worry you is that initially the firm doesn't have any profits. And therefore, giving them a tax credit is meaningless because they don't pay taxes, corporate taxes. So it's sort of crucial to have these to be able to use the tax credit in the future. Now, along this line, I can tell you that at least in the biotech pharmaceutical area, I've talked to enough people, doing finance, that that's an area where R&D takes a long time. Okay, D in particular, development, because clinical trials take a while, and therefore, what those firms do, if they want to, what they do is they plan way ahead. And they might, particularly a biotech, might have quite a loss for quite a few years because they're basically just investing in trying to find a new drug to develop and then trying to develop a new drug. And they make use of this provision very much. They do pro forma income statements, 10 years out, to make sure that they have the cash flow to keep the R&D going. So that the loss carry forward becomes quite important for them. Many countries have a ceiling on how much any individual firm can take, which always struck me as a bit silly, because just because you're twice as big doesn't mean you should, have less benefit from the subsidy than some other firm. Doesn't seem, for one thing, it gives you an incentive to break into two firms. It doesn't make any sense to me, but but I think it's just a worry that we'll spend too much money, I think is what it comes down to. But the final point is an interesting one, which is that the Dutch pioneered this. and it is used, I have a graph actually that shows you where it's used, which actually has advantages because all firms with employees pay social charges, okay? That's uniform, even if they have no profits. So this is simpler because the 90% of R&D is effectively a cost of personnel. It's the guy plus the lab bench. You know, every guy needs a lab bench, kind of. Every guy needs a computer, and so forth. Could be a girl, too. So it's personnel related. R&D spending is basically personnel related. A very small part of it is capital spending. And therefore, if you reduce the social charges on science and engineering employment for R&D, what happens is that's an automatic tax relief that kicks in immediately, which is very good for new and young firms, okay? Because you don't need the profits. And it's simpler, right? You don't have this loss carry forward nonsense and so forth, trying to compute how much it'll benefit you 5 years from now, and so forth. So I think, I think it's a very, it's not one we use in the US, but I think it is actually an interesting idea. Patent boxes. Basically, I'm not in favor of them. It should come through from this slide. Let me say at the outset that an IP box, okay, in principle is broader than subsidizing R&D. A patent box is probably narrower. Not completely, but it's probably somewhat narrower because there's R&D towards things that aren't patentable. But an IP box, of course, is broader, but you think about the problems of trying to calculate the income associated with a particular copyright or associated with a particular trademark. There's a lot of room for fudge there, which means the tax authorities are really faced with an audit cost. I mean, the R&D audit cost is minor compared to the problem of trying to figure out what the income is from a particular intellectual property asset, because most are bundles, right? Most products are bundles of lots of, their money is being made for lots of different, from lots of different form of IP. So I prefer R&D tax credits. I'm not the only one. Because they're directly related to the firm's decision of what to spend, okay, as opposed to really being related to its luck and what it's found. You don't have this incentive to transfer patents to low tax jurisdictions, at least not for the R&D tax credit. It turns out that there are incentives to transfer patents to low tax jurisdictions regardless of whether there's a patent box or not. There's already incentives for that. Lots of patents get transferred to Ireland, just so you can claim the income is going to Ireland, even without a patent box. Because what you do at that point is you pay a royalty on the use of the patent, right? And so if the US firm is paying a large royalty to Ireland for the use of the patents that it's transferred there, multinational, right? The net result is much lower income in the US, much higher income at low tax rates in Ireland. So I mean, you can do it without resorting to a patent box. So it's not even clear. It's not clear, and I'll talk about this more, how much difference this is going to make. But the second thing is a different. It's similar, but it's a different point, which is that essentially, once you have a patent box, now you have an incentive to keep zombie patents alive, okay? Patents which are not really covering anything that you're doing, right? Which you wouldn't have used otherwise, but if you can figure out some way to attach an income to it, you now keep that patent in force, which means other people now have to worry about that patent. So there's a kind of a general equilibrium cost because you end up with more patents in the system, which increase the costs of search if you're trying to enter. We already have a search cost in IT. It's well known that if you seriously searched patents, for example, in software, it would take every time you wanted to invent something new in that area, it would take the entire R&D budget in the US, okay, because it requires expensive lawyers to do it. And there are hundreds of thousands of the patents. So we already have a problem. We don't need another incentive to keep zombie patents alive. Patent boxes target the part of the innovation that's the most appropriable part to begin with, right? So, which is not really, you really wanted to target the part that you weren't going to get anyway, not the part that you would get anyway. They're much higher audit cost. The design has been all over the place around countries, partly related to the fact that they know that income is going to be hard to measure. So sometimes it's gross, not net, and things like that. And that creates funny incentives about where you're going to put your expenses, how you're going to allocate your expenses, which of course is, there's a certain amount of flexibility in that. Okay, so that's, so then I'll tell you the basic facts about who's got these things. So for the R&D tax relief, the blue, the bright blue, is countries that use both tax relief and social charge reduction. And you can see that that includes France, and it actually includes Belgium as well as the Netherlands. And the light blue is tax relief only as of, this is around 2015, 2016. These things have been coming online relatively continuously, so sometimes I'm not even, I have to go to Price Waterhouse or somebody to find out what the latest rules are. One thing you'll note, of course, is that Mexico is white in this graph. That's because the new thing came in 2017, this year. And I suspect that you can't see Chile, but Chile has definitely has tax relief. And in Africa, it's only South Africa. Okay, so I'll move on. IP boxes are essentially European, plus Japan has one. Okay. There's a lot of debate in the US right now, but presumably we don't have time for that because we're engaged in all kinds of silly other activities. We have an essentially dysfunctional government, although I think the UK probably is, trying to compete with us on that one. So you can see it's a Western European thing, with the exception of Turkey, who's not on this map, and I suppose, Hungary and Slovakia, so that have introduced patent boxes as of now. This is somewhat more interesting but harder to read, so I will try to explain it to you. This is the total government support for R&D across countries. Okay, very interesting graph produced by the OECD, which have really been pioneers in figuring this stuff out. It's as a share of GDP, so we've adjusted for country size in terms of its income levels. And I've highlighted the 3 Latin American countries because that's, of interest here. If you look, the 2 countries at the far left with the biggest share, which is 0.4%, okay, of GDP spent on R&D by the government, not by the whole country, but by the government, are Russia and France, but you can see that the composition is very, very different. In Russia, I'm trying to get my little pointer. In Russia, most of the spending is government spending, and that's probably, a lot of that is probably defense. For France, more than half the spending is tax incentives. The French have been pioneers on tax incentives. They've done all kinds of stuff to try to boost the innovative activity in France, except the obvious one, which is change the employment legislation. And then the rest, you can see that it's just enormous variability. The little marks here are the support to R&D in 2006 as a share of GDP. And you can see that in general, well, sometimes you can't see them, but in general, the support in 2006 was much lower, okay? So there's been a growth in this government support for R&D over these 8 years. Now, Brazil here has more direct support and less tax incentive, and it has increased a lot in those 8 years. Mexico is shown as having all direct support, roughly comparable to New Zealand and Finland, right? So it's sitting there between New Zealand and Finland, interesting. Brazil is between Spain and Greece, okay? And then Chile is the other country here, and it's like Mexico. Chile and Mexico are in the OECD. Brazil is one of the BRICS that cooperates with the OECD on generating these numbers, okay? So that's how these 3 countries end up being here. Chile has about an even split, but it's a rather small number, and they had nothing in 2006, okay? So, so that's where it stands. Chile is like Lithuania and Romania. Well, actually, Romania is considerably higher. It's more like Lithuania and what I think, it's very hard for me to know because these are the 3-letter abbreviations, which I haven't memorized. That may be Switzerland next to it, next to Lithuania. I'm not actually sure. I don't think it's the Czech Republic. Yeah, well, if so, that's a funny abbreviation because the 2-letter abbreviation is CZ. So I don't see why they would use H. So now, so let's talk about these a little more, and mainly about the Mexican one. My reading of the rules is that Mexico used to have some kind of R&D tax credit. It was eliminated in 2010 in favor of subsidies, and then it was introduced again this year. But it seems to be designed as an incremental on the basis of the past 3 years of spending on R&D by the firm. That is what the US started out with in 1981, okay, and abandoned in 1988 or so, 86 or 88, because it doesn't work out to be 30%. It works out to be considerably lower. When you take account of its effects on the firm behavior in the subsequent years, and I'll give you the numbers, but I just let's finish this. Brazil's system is unbelievably complex. I couldn't even make out whether what the story was, but it turns out the take-up is very low, which may be related to the fact that it's unbelievably complex. Which may be related to the fact that they're trying to save money. This is typically what happens in this type of legislation, which is there's an argument for making it simple and doing this, but then it confronts budget realities and you start excluding different activities and so forth, and it gets complex. Chile introduced a volume credit in 2008 with, and that's why you saw the difference on that graph between no support and then suddenly some tax support, with a net subsidy rate of 10, depending on whether you're a small or a large firm and how you're being financed, and whether you're a loss-making firm or a profit-making firm, 10 to 29%, but the rate seems to have gone up recently. I don't know the exact numbers. Okay, so for the mathematicians in the room, we can calculate, at least, this is very simplified, but what the problem is. Theta is a tax credit rate, R is R&D spending, little pi is the current profit, and big pi is the present discounted value of profits into the future, which is to say it's sort of the value of the ongoing firm. Beta is a discount rate, meaning it's something that is between 0.9 or 0.8 and 1, something like that. So the idea is if you increase R&D by delta RT, okay, in year T, the tax credit benefit is the change, which is the change in your take-home income. By profit, I don't mean taxable profit. What I mean is net profit, profit after taxes. The tax credit benefit is the credit rate times your increase in R&D. Okay. I'm ignoring, by the way, the inflation rates here. That'll change things, but not by a lot, unless you have hyperinflation or something. For the next 3 years, this increase in your R&D that you did is going to hit the base when you go to do the R&D tax credit in the subsequent years. Okay, it's going to raise the base, which means you get lower benefits in the subsequent years. So, so there's a cost associated with this benefit, which is, because it's average over 3 years, it's the tax credit rate over 3 times the increase in R&D you had this year, and you will not benefit from in the subsequent years. The total impact of the increase in R&D is therefore, which is the change in your present discounted value of your profits, is the credit rate times the increase in R&D times 1 minus the discount rate for next year, the discount rate for 2 years from now, plus the discount rate for 3 years from now, divided by 3. Okay, I mean, that's just algebra from the other thing. Okay, so, so the derivative, okay, if you want to say the marginal benefit that you get from increasing your R&D on your present discounted value profits, so the change in value, is that. It's just, you know, I just put the delta R over the, you know, it's a linear formula. It's easy. But the point here is the graph. If the discount rate is 1, if a dollar, you know, or peso next year is worth the same as this year, then the actual credit rate is 0, okay? Because 1 plus 1 plus 1 divided by 3 is 1. If the discount rate is 0.95, okay, then the actual credit rate is 3%. If the discount rate is 0.9, which is probably closer to being realistic, it might even be less than that, then the actual credit rate is 5.7% instead of 30%. So the point of this is not that it's not going to have some impact, but it's going to be rather small if you take this formula seriously. Now, this is a firm that is capable of looking forward perfectly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that firms are myopic, or there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what will happen to the legislation 2 years from now, okay? This obviously doesn't hold. But it is the thing we discovered back in the 1980s, and I was intrigued to discover that the law was written this way, and that's where I was hoping somebody here might know more about it than I do. So we'll wait for the questions for that. We just want to make sure we get to the questions. So the evidence on R&D tax credits, I don't spend a lot of time on this, okay? And the reason is because the evidence is fairly compelling. Firms do respond to this, to R&D tax credits in general, and many countries have looked at it. And I did research in '93 based on the original incremental credit. Now, one advantage of the original incremental credit, which was good for me, right? Good for the econometrician, wasn't so great for companies, but it was good for the econometrician, was that because of the loss carry forwards, different profit statuses of firms, the fact that it had this, you know, crazy effect of taking account of, having to take account of future R&D increases, et cetera, et cetera. We had a lot of dispersion in the price of R&D, which meant you could look across companies, and you didn't have to look across time, which is, looking across time is always problematic, okay, looking at aggregates, because across time there are lots of other things driving the R&D spending decision. But if you looked across countries within an industry, companies within an industry, and you had different costs of R&D because of the tax differences, you could measure what the response was going to be, and the response was basically, it was either elasticity of 1 or even higher, okay? Now, John Van Reenen and I did a survey of all the work that had been done until 2000, and the work was quite similar in the sense that 1 was the modal number, which said if, you know, you reduce the price of R&D, the cost of R&D by 10%, you got a 10% increase in spending. Which means that if you increase R&D spending, you increase it on the margin by the amount of lost tax revenue, basically, which means you get what you pay for. However, there's a body of research, Wilson using state data. So one of the features of the US system is, you know, of course we have 50 states, right? I mean, the 50 states have local governments that are in some cases quite powerful, and in my own country case, decide that they're going to be counterpoints to the feds. So they make all kinds of decisions that are not necessarily the same as the federal government. Among other things, many states have R&D tax credits. On the other hand, it's very easy, not very easy, but it is somewhat easy to move your R&D lab from one state to another, at least once, right? You can't do it every year, but it's something that can be undertaken. There's a fair amount of mobility within the US. And because of this, Wilson was able to look across states and discover that there is wasteful tax competition in the sense that what the R&D credit was at the California level or the Ohio level was doing was causing people to move there from other places where they'd been doing R&D. No net increase in US R&D, just moving it from one state to another. Bloom and Griffith did a paper on Europe, which essentially said the same thing, and now Corrado and Haskell and others have been doing it with a wider group of countries. A second point I wanted to make for people who are doing research in this area is just to be sure to look at the OECD, because they've been pioneering studies of all of these, different instruments and are building a database, basically, of a time series of effective R&D costs, which vary a lot by lost profit status and size of firm across countries. So it's not just one number per country. It's at least 4 numbers per country, and it's worth looking at. Now, patent boxes. Recently, there's been quite a bit of research on this because there's an interest in, obviously, in the policy arena about this. I guess I will underline a couple of things here. One, because I would like to let people talk. One is MNEs do shift patents in response, according to Altstetter et al. We found a fairly weak response in our research using patent transfers. This is stuff we're doing now. Ours are European Patent Office patents, all of them. About 12% of them are transfers, 12% of the transfers are transfers between countries. Not all, more than half are probably within the same multinational holding group, which is where you would expect the transfer for financial reasons, right? If I want to transfer from IBM in Germany to IBM in the Netherlands, because the Dutch have a very attractive patent box. What we found in particular was that this famous thing called the nexus requirement. Okay, this is a very important issue in patent box design. Nexus requirement essentially says that the patent whose income you're claiming a lower corporate tax on, the invention has to have been developed in the country on which you're claiming the lower tax rate. This is not widely imposed by patent boxes now, but the European Commission is in the process, essentially, of designing rules that will impose this requirement. This mitigates against transferring patents to take advantage of a patent box, because you're supposed to do some development in the country where the patent box is. It's supposed to make sure that the patent box is actually encouraging innovation in that country rather than simply being a tax maneuver of just moving the patent. So what we found was this is indeed true. Okay, we saw an effect that given a patent box, firms would transfer patents to that country to take advantage of it, but it was only boxes that didn't have this nexus requirement. So that's support for the idea that maybe you can mitigate this with a nexus requirement. The other thing you find is that, and we're not the only ones to find this, is that more valuable patents get transferred, which is exactly what you'd expect, okay? Because those are the ones that have income attached to them, so you can, profit from it. However, we have the discouraging result that you just cannot find an impact on invention activity in the patent box country. In other words, if you're doing this at all, you're doing it because you think you might be encouraging invention or innovation in the country with the patent box, the same way you manage to get more R&D with the R&D tax credit. And you cannot see yet any evidence of that activity. It's also the case that a lot of this research shows you that patent location responds to corporate tax rates already. I mean, people are already moving patents to do this royalty game that I was describing. Well, we don't really want to try to look at this. I'll just summarize it. This is the balance of patents in, patents out for different countries. It's generally negative for large countries. In other words, they send out more patents than they take in. US, Japan, Canada, Australia. It's generally positive for tax havens, okay, which is to say they receive more patents than they send out to other countries. This is what you'd expect. It's just the raw data behind what I've discussed. So the last few things to talk about are, do countries provide enough support for R&D? Well, this has been studied for a long time. Unfortunately, we have evidence, we have a lot of evidence, but it is based on cross-country regression and so forth and so on. I mean, it has, you know, it's not, we don't have the perfect experiment, we don't have an alternative universe of countries just like Japan and the US and, you know, Mexico, where they're spending less on R&D or more on R&D. We don't have the proper experiment and we can't run the proper experiment. But there is considerable evidence that the returns at the country level to the R&D that they're spending are higher than individual private returns, okay. I cited a few of the cross-country studies, but there's also a lot of firm-level work. I just, you know, that tries to get at the social returns. There are just so many studies, I can't really cite them all. But there's some nuance that we've learned. You know, there are things we've learned. One is something which those of you who know about regional agglomeration, et cetera, will find not very surprising. Domestic spillovers are larger than those from other countries. Okay, this is important because this tells you that it's not enough just to free ride on what the, you know, Europe is doing or what the US is doing and so forth. There is a benefit to having it local. Spillovers from foreign R&D are more important for small open economies than they are for US, Japan, and Germany. Again, not surprising, but we have confirmed this fact. Absorptive capacity matters, which is related to point 1, okay. In other words, you've got to have a certain level of R&D spending, et cetera, to understand the stuff you're going to bring in. So to make good use of the information that you might be learning. And the social rates of return, this is where I said it's very fuzzy here because they can be quite large, but they're also extremely imprecise in almost every piece of research. I cite this interesting theoretical work, which again, you know, keep in mind that any theoretical macroeconomic model is a great oversimplification of how things actually work. Right? Plus, they're generally, the Jones and Williams is a closed economy model. Okay, right? I mean, it's a US closed economy model. Doesn't take account of anything going on outside, which is, you know, might have once been a good way to do things, not so much anymore. But they use an endogenous growth model of the, you know, usual sort and try to compute what's the socially optimal R&D investment, you know, based on its cumulative nature, et cetera, which is a feature of the endogenous growth models. And they say, well, it should be 2 to 4 times what's actually being spent in the US. And so you can take that with a grain of salt or not, as you choose. But it's an interesting stylized fact. International coordination, should policies be better coordinated between countries? I think the second point is a very important point, and this is where the patent box was a serious problem within Europe, because as soon as one country had it, then another country wanted it, you know, because they had to have it to keep the, yeah, that's good. They had to have it to keep the, you know, to keep the stuff in their country, right? And in fact, there's a well-known story about the UK patent box, which was that fundamentally it was a bribe to one firm to keep their employment in the UK, and it was not successful, and so now they have a patent box. The evidence I cited earlier is essentially the evidence that there can be wasteful tax competition on R&D tax credits, and it can be true of other things. One thing I want to caution people on, because some of these papers in general find equal and opposite elasticity. So if the elasticity is 1 for moving stuff into my country, it's -1 to move stuff out. Equal and opposite does not mean equal, okay? These are elasticities, so the relative size of the countries matter. And so it isn't quite a zero-sum game. It really does depend on whether you're small or large and so forth. So we probably don't want to spend too much time on this. This was a discussion of an issue which may be relevant for some Latin American countries, because the superdeduction, which is a different approach than a tax credit. Superdeduction is the idea that normally we deduct 100% of R&D expense from income. That is the way most, I think that's international accounting standards, actually. A superdeduction is I can deduct 150% or 200%. And several countries do use this. What I referred to as a tax credit earlier included the superdeduction regimes. There's just too much complexity to show you it all. And the point about this is that if you're going to do superdeductions, they're not going to work very well if you have a low tax rate, corporate tax rate. Okay, they work to 0. I mean, it makes no difference if you have a 0 corporate tax rate. A tax credit will work better. If you have a 10% rate, the reduction in cost is about 5% here. But if you're like the U.S. and you have 30 or 35% rate on the margin, then the reduction from a superdeduction can be quite large from unit cost, which is here. So this is, this is how much does it, this is the price in a sense. I'm sorry, unit cost is here, okay, 100%. So if I'm here, that's 0.8, I'm paying 20% less for my R&D. So the reduction in cost is 20%. And that's probably in an area. So just a few notes on that. And then I did a back of the envelope computation of how much extra growth would countries achieve if they were to expand support for R&D, but that's really back of the envelope, so I don't want to stand behind that. I've stopped there, and oh, Alenka's here, welcome. And traffic, and let people ask questions. Oh, and I better put this on. Yeah.
Bueno, pues después de la excelente exposición de Bronwyn Hall, que nos expone, pues digamos, una manera en cómo pensar el diseño de las políticas para la innovación y entonces pues abrimos al público las preguntas que quieran formularle a Bronwyn Hall. ¿Sí? ¿Quién da? ¿Sí?
Good morning. I was very excited to hear about this conference, which made things very embarrassing because I'm late. I was just wondering, I took a course in the WIPO, and something it was mentioned in the course was the approach of how intellectual property could be taxated. So in relation with your exposition, do you have, perhaps I missed it, I wouldn't know, but do you have any knowledge of how the US or maybe other countries are taxating intellectual property, since I think the issue is related with I&D? Thank you.
It's a little hard to hear from back there for me. I mean, because my ears aren't
¿Puedes
that good.
repetir la pregunta?
But I think you asked how intellectual property is taxed in the U.S. and other countries.
The thing is that in the WIPO it was mentioned that intellectual property, by the end, it's a property. So since it's a property,
Yeah.
you know what I
okay.
mean now? Okay.
Yeah, well, some of us are not so happy with the property interpretation, but that has to do with the fact that it leads to bad policy in some cases. I mean, there's a problem with calling it intellectual property to begin with, even though I call it intellectual property, because of the fact that it can be used by more than one person. You know, knowledge is, in a sense, knowledge wants to be free, and so there is an issue. As soon as you call it property, you automatically start trying to do things in parallel with tangible property, and which is not very productive for enhancing growth. It's better to treat it as a separate activity. We do not have in the U.S., except for domestic real estate and commercial real estate at the local level, we do not have wealth taxes, okay? Which means we don't have a property tax at the federal government level, right? Which means we're not taxing it as property. I mean, there wouldn't be any argument for taxing it as property because we don't tax other property that way. So I think that's what you were asking. The patent box, of course, is a completely different, oh, sorry. The patent box is a completely different activity because what that is doing is reducing the taxation on the income from the property. Now, the intellectual property held by the firm is, in some cases, part of its assets, especially if it was purchased, right? So the income from that is being taxed, but because we don't have a wealth tax, it's on firms. It's not. It would make absolutely no sense to tax intellectual property unless you've decided to tax tangible property also. I guess that's my reaction.
Bueno, ahora sí, tú.
Hello, good morning. I come from Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina. I had two questions. One, the first is if you have any research on university proximity as an incentive for R&D. And the second one, that's a bit selfish, is given that in your graph, Argentina was the only Latin American country with both reductions in tax and social charges, if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I actually don't, I know almost zilch about Argentina, unfortunately, other than a couple of papers on the results of R&D subsidies. I did not realize until I was doing this presentation that Argentina had both, and I would like to know why. It's not the only country that has both, and I suspect that where there is both, my suspicion is that the tax systems are developed in such a way that it is simpler not to have a loss carry forward provision. And therefore, if you want to reach loss-making firms or new firms and so forth, that the social charge method is a better way to do it. And it depends on how sophisticated your tax administration system is and how much tax evasion there is. And it varies a lot around the world. And my suspicion is that this is the reason there are two is because they've had trouble with trying to administer one. And you know, you see this in other countries too. It's not just Argentina. The other thing is that what I know about Argentina's macroeconomy is there have been a lot of other stuff going on, and it's possible that different administrations introduce different programs, for example, and it's always hard to get rid of them. That's another. Now, you asked about university studies of the impact on universities. Was that what you were? Of the credits towards university collaboration, or I'm actually not. I don't know the answer. As I'm going to tell you, I don't actually know. But it's an interesting question. So now I'm thinking, oh, maybe I should go look.
Sí. Bueno, ahora sí.
Yes, it would be a nice PhD. So. For that question. My question is about the very small firms. I'm Joost Huijs from Spain. In Spain, tax schemes for support for R&D, you have to prove exactly what you are doing. That means that there's an exclusion of very small firms who are working on part-time base in R&D. In Germany in the late 70s, the beginning 80s, you had the subsidies for salaries of R&D. But nowadays, how can you be sure that those kind of firms also can get support and not discriminated by the other firms who are more systematically in their R&D?
Yeah, this is something I noticed, and I should say for the benefit of all of you that, so I talk from a 35,000-foot level. These schemes, these R&D tax credit schemes, are enormously complicated and vary very much across country. And he just hit on something which I've noticed in several of the countries, which is that you have to, it's kind of like you need an R&D lab to benefit, okay? Now, this is not true of the US scheme, which is the one I know the best, but it is true of some of the other schemes, and I suspect, again, it's related to this auditing problem. It's that if I have a small firm claiming that 2 of its employees are working half-time on R&D, it's not worth my audit time to go in and check on that, and therefore I exclude that, okay? I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying I can see how it happens. Because the fear is, especially in countries that have more tax evasion than others, the fear is that this is yet another avenue to evade taxes, okay? And you lose money as a result, and you can't audit the small firms. Now, my reaction to this would be that probably a better design in this instance is not an R&D tax credit. It's actually some, better, lower tax treatment for the firm to begin with, or possibly reduce social charges, because that, for the new startups, that has the wonderful benefit of encouraging employment, which is, of course, the real Spanish problem. It's not do they do enough R&D, it's that they have an employment problem. They have a lot of unemployed. Yeah, I mean, it's a well-known fact. And so my suspicion is that that's a simpler way to do things, and it does encourage startups. It doesn't target technology-based startups, but if those are a good idea, those are going to happen.
José Luis.
José Luis Olleiro, National University of Mexico. Thank you. You gave us an explanation, a mathematical explanation, on the very marginal impact to be expected of the tax credits in Mexico. What would you recommend to make a transition to a sounder system? And my second question is, could you explain how to build the patent box system? How is it designed in Europe?
Yeah, okay, so the first thing is the hard question. Because this is one that the U.S. tax authorities have, the U.S. legislature has wrestled with. And after they discovered this economists pointed out that there was this weak effect, they redesigned it so that they used the history of the firm, but a few years before. Okay, so in '88, when they 88 or 91, I think it was. Yeah, 91 was a new bill. When they reintroduced the credit, they used the average R&D intensity from 84 to 88. 1984 to 1988, so 3 years back to 9 years before, something 8 years before. Well, this is not very good over time because you use a fixed period, and of course everything changes, the composition changes, etc. At the moment, be honest, I can't remember exactly. I think they're still using that, but they've developed a bunch of techniques like smaller firms, which in the US could be fairly big, okay, have just a flat rate. So the firms are offered a choice. They can do an incremental credit at a fairly high rate, like 20 or 30%, or they can do what's called a volume credit, which is all of the R&D, but it's at a much lower rate. Now that's one way to get the firms to self-select into, I'm a growth firm, so I mean, my R&D is growing rapidly, so the incremental one looks really good, or I'm established, maybe the volume credit looks a little better. France has gone to a volume credit precisely because the incremental one is so difficult. And the trouble is the volume credit is not as big an incentive to increase the R&D. So one possibility is to use industry levels. And the only problem with that is firms assigning themselves to industries is you know that the average rate in a pharma industry is going to be higher than an average rate in textiles. You already, you can see that. So you could sort of say, okay, I'm going to go out and look at the U.S. R&D intensity and use that intensity as a base or something. Or use our own industry intensity. This works if you adjust it, because intensities change. The U.S. textile industry, for example, which has shrunk enormously over time, the only profitable part of it is the high-tech part, with the brand new, specialized products, things like that. And of course, they do more R&D than they used to back when they were commodity producers. So that's my answer. Patent boxes, there's no problem. Just don't use them. So you don't have to design them. It's easy. If you insist on doing it, you have to figure out some way to calculate what's the income from that patent or that group of patents, and then you have to figure out what were the expenses in developing that innovation. Okay, because that includes more than the R&D. In the laws, that's how the laws read. I mean, they do include more than the R&D. I just think it's nuts. I mean, it's asking for trouble. In fact, I really think the patent box really is nuts. I think the IP box, I understand what it's about, because there's lots of innovation out there which is not R&D based. And so you could imagine that if you could measure that stuff, it might be good to incentivize it. Better to just have an investment tax credit, though, which you can administer at relatively low cost. Okay, that's all I want to say on that.
Bueno, vamos a tomar dos preguntas juntas. Vincent.
Yes,
Okay.
so I don't think you need to translate, as my Spanish is probably worse than yours. No, I have a question that pertains to the observation that you made in the beginning, that tax credits, they require competence in the tax office. And given recent experiences in my country, Denmark, related to problems in collecting regular taxes, that's just regular income tax and also corporate taxes, then one can perhaps question actually this ability. If they are not able to do the simple thing, are they then able to do the more complicated stuff? Now, the question is for R&D, of course, how much does that matter? And do we know anything about the ability across countries, for instance, to actually collect or actually to give these credit in a reasonable way? And if there are biases, how would then sort of influence the value of the instrument? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that there has been some research in the U.S. It tends to be published in the tax journals, and I'm sort of a little bit away from that, so I can't even remember the details. At this point, I know that it's the area that the tax authorities complain about the most, and it is related to this fact of lacking specialized knowledge. That's the firms complain a lot about them disallowing stuff, okay, because they don't understand what R&D is. Also, it's important to remember that the R&D reported on the income statements of firms, at least in the U.S., and since other countries have imitated our credit in some other countries, is a different number from the one that the credit allows. So when the research credit was put in, it was put in as a research and experimentation credit, and which meant it excluded some so-called routine development. Well, your guess is as good as mine as to which part of development is routine and which part is not. And I'm afraid that's where the area where the tax authorities had the worst trouble. For example, Boeing, which is, has a huge development cost, right? And a lot of that stuff is sitting in the wind tunnel up in Seattle, tuning the thing, figuring out, it may be even flying a plane around, and then tuning it and so forth. And there's ongoing development. I mean, for example, it's well known that One of Nate Rosenberg's favorite examples for learning by doing was the stretching of the 747 airframe. We're now out to 400, unfortunately discontinuing its use, too bad. But it starts out as a smaller plane, and then they gradually figure out how to make it longer and still make it fly safely, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Boeing got into a big snit with the R&D people trying to figure out, what fraction of this was actually R&D. Or R&E, I should say, research and experimentation, and therefore deductible. They couldn't even figure out what fraction was R&D for the purposes of financial accounting, and what was just routine maintenance or whatever. Anyway, and that's Boeing. I mean, they're supposed to understand their business. But it was more, they couldn't figure out what the other guy would think, They were having a lot of trouble with this. So I think the place to look for the answer to Kel's question is actually the OECD at the country level does studies in this area, in the area of R&D. And it's actually, if you want to know country by country, that is the best place to look because there's a lot more detail than what I've been giving you.
Bueno, tenemos 5 minutos, de tal manera que hay 2 preguntas más. Por favor, formulen las preguntas.
Sí, soy Xavier Vence, de la Universidad de Santiago de Compostela. De su presentación y de los estudios que han venido realizando en los últimos años, creo que hay buena evidencia de digamos, el impacto dudoso que tienen los diferentes mecanismos de incentivación de la I+D empresarial por la vía de los créditos fiscales, de la vía fiscal y también de la relacionada con, tanto si es relacionado con I+D como si es relacionado con las patentes, ¿no? Y veo que hay realmente diagnosticado buenos mecanismos perversos y comportamientos oportunistas por parte de las empresas cuando hacen uso de esos mecanismos. Pero yo quería preguntarle una cuestión algo diferente sobre la relevancia de estos mecanismos frente a otros para las políticas públicas, en el sentido de que estos mecanismos no permiten al gobierno orientar la I+D, la investigación o la innovación en una dirección o en otra. Digamos que estos mecanismos confían en la orientación de las empresas, la dirección, la orientación de las actividades de I+D e innovación, con lo cual, si un gobierno quiere ir hacia un modelo productivo más sustentable, a un modelo productivo que busque otro tipo de objetivos sociales, este tipo de mecanismos son muy defectuosos para poder orientar esa actividad de innovación de las empresas, ¿no? ¿Cuál es su opinión sobre esto? Quiere decir que en qué medida estos mecanismos son recursos que al final no sirven para que los gobiernos puedan orientar con criterios de país y con criterios sociales la actividad de I+D o de innovación de su tejido productivo.
Sí. Bueno, ahora vamos con la última de Ari. Ajá.
Thank you for the very erudite and also practical presentation. Oh, sorry. I'm thanking you for your both erudite and practical presentation. I'm Ari Plonsky from University of São Paulo, in that nice, albeit complex country called Brazil that you mentioned. My question has to do with the time factor, which has 2 aspects. The first is that usually governments who are in charge of designing the tax system have a very short span of expectation of when the tax effects will happen. It means if it doesn't happen the next 3-year accounting for the OECD equivalent measure of innovation, they become nervous. And this makes them change the tax design very often, which makes companies less confident. So can you recognize this as a relevant factor? Do you have any research that you can mention? You mentioned so many that took into account the time factor.
That's both really good questions. In answer to your question, my tendency here is, as I pointed out, the subsidy approach tends, although it's not necessarily true that they have the tax credits and subsidies have different project choice. You could, in fact, design a tax credit that was very targeted, or you could have a subsidy where you just gave money to everybody. But in fact, they tend to operate in two different ways. My own feeling is that you need both. Why? Because government, I don't know about you, but I don't have faith in government of knowing every innovation that might be useful. Okay? More minds are better than few minds. And in many cases, a company close to the market has a much better idea of a good innovation than a government bureaucrat. On the other hand, there are many things you want to spend money on that are not going to come from private firms. And so you are going to want to guide, or they're going to partly come from private firms, but the public-private interaction is going to be a good thing for generating them. I mentioned standards, enabling technologies, pre-commercial things of certain types. I mean, we have a lot of programs of that type. Small business administration research, set-asides for small business across different departments, government departments in the US, the advanced technology program, and so forth and so on. So my view is you need a balance, you need a package. But which balance? I tried to find it. There is one paper that tries to look at this, and I can't find it. Now, the answer to, oh, wait a minute, now I've forgotten what the other, oh yes, the timing problem. Okay, so in the US, this was a long-standing dispute. From 1981 until very recently, economists were saying, including me, every time they talked about the R&D tax credit, the whole problem with it is it's not permanent. And it wasn't permanent because, for budgetary reasons, it was easier to make it not permanent, okay? It had to do with where you charged it. And so the legislature didn't want to make it permanent. They finally did, after people were telling them for 30 years that it should be permanent. Now, permanent, it's in quotes, right? Because you can still change the law. But at least at this point, it doesn't have an expiration date, which is what was true before. I don't, other than the knowledge that firms do like an environment which is not changing all the time, which I totally, I mean, just look at, just look at the UK, you can see, total panic. Firms, renting space in Frankfurt in order to be prepared to move if they have to move, this kind of thing. And it's a huge cost. They're even reserving school places for the kids of the employees if they have to move them from the city to Frankfurt. And that's just, it's a lot of cost which if they could plan ahead, they wouldn't have to spend. So I'm sympathetic to the problem. The trouble is that the world changes. There are stochastic shocks all over the place, and at some level you do have to, your tax system does have to adapt to them. Probably it shouldn't adapt quite as often as politicians want it to adapt. And we discussed this in the Argentina case, that there was a lot of change that has gone on. Even Mexico, getting rid of R&D tax credits in 2010 in favor of subsidies and bringing them back on in 2017. That's quite a bit of change. Okay, I know we need to finish, so I'll stop.
Okay. Pues muchas gracias. Agradecemos la excelente conferencia de Bronwyn Hall, que nos compartió pues el conocimiento que tiene sobre el tema. Bueno.